The scalpel was already in her hand when Harvey Brenner kicked open the door of the makeshift surgery and told her she had to leave Caldwell Valley by morning or he would drag her out himself. Theresa Lockhart did not flinch. She did not lower the instrument. She had a man on the table in front of her, a miner named Clyde Purcell whose left arm had been crushed beneath a collapsed timber, and the chloroform cloth was already doing its quiet work, and Clyde had perhaps 40 minutes before the shock took him somewhere she could not follow. So she looked at Harvey Brenner with his broad shoulders filling the entire doorframe and his jaw set like something carved from the same granite the miners were destroying to get rich, and she said very quietly, "Get out of my surgery." He did not move. "I said get out," she repeated, and her voice did not shake because she had learned in Philadelphia in the wards of Pennsylvania Hospital that a voice that shook cost lives. Harvey Brenner stared at her. He stared at the man on the table. He stared at the physician's bag on the floor, worn brown leather cracked at the hinges, the brass clasp worn smooth from 10,000 openings, and something crossed his face that was not anger and was not admiration, and was not quite either of those things but lived somewhere in the bruised country between them. "The county commissioner says you haven't got a license to practice in Nevada territory," Harvey said. "The county commissioner has never watched a child die from a ruptured appendix for want of a trained physician," Theresa said. "And the man on this table will die in 30 minutes if you don't let me work. So either hold that lantern higher and make yourself useful, or get out of my surgery, Mr. Brenner. Those are your only two choices." The lantern he held swung slightly in the wind coming through the kicked-open door. Caldwell Valley breathed cold desert air at night, even in June, and the flame inside the glass wobbled. Harvey Brenner looked at Clyde Purcell on the table, a man he had known for 11 years, who had a wife and 2 young sons living in the mining camp at the base of the ridge, and something in him, the hard practical thing that had kept him alive out here for 34 years, made the decision for him. He stepped inside. He lifted the lantern. He held it where the light was best. And that was the moment Theresa Lockhart understood that whatever had brought her to this valley, whatever dark chain of events and hidden motives and secrets she had not yet uncovered, this man was not her enemy. He might be her problem. He might be her complication. But he was not her enemy. She did not know yet how much more complicated that distinction was going to become. 6 weeks earlier, the train from Philadelphia had carried her as far as Elko, Nevada. And from Elko, a stagecoach had rattled her across 40 miles of high desert and alkali flat to the small settlement called Caldwell Valley. The valley was real, a long green wound cut between 2 ridges of brown rock by a river called the Humboldt's Western Fork, though no map she had ever seen acknowledged that tributary. There were ponderosa pines on the upper slopes and sage everywhere else, and the air smelled like dust and iron and something clean underneath both of those things, something she associated with weather coming from a great distance. She had arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early May of 1882, wearing a traveling dress that had been practical in Philadelphia, and was now covered in a fine white powder from the alkali flats, carrying the physician's bag her father had given her, and a trunk containing everything she owned. The stagecoach driver, a taciturn man named Amos, had set her trunk on the boardwalk in front of Caldwell Valley's single general store and driven away before she had the chance to ask him where the hotel was. There was no hotel. She learned this from the woman who came out of the general store to stare at her. The woman was perhaps 60, with silver hair and a face that had spent 40 years in the desert sun and was magnificent for it. Her name was Ruth Calder, and she owned the store, and she looked at Theresa with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been relief. "You the woman who answered the notice?" Ruth asked. Theresa pulled the folded newspaper clipping from her coat pocket. The notice had run in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which was unusual. Most frontier settlements posted notices in Western papers, if they posted them at all. But someone had sent this notice east deliberately, which had struck her as significant when she first read it 3 months ago, sitting in the reading room of Pennsylvania Hospital with her career in pieces around her. The notice read, "Physician needed. Caldwell Valley, Nevada Territory. Permanent position. Good compensation. Community of 400 souls and growing. Apply by correspondence to R. Calder, Caldwell Valley General Store." She had applied. She had received a letter back within 2 weeks, offering her the position. She had not told anyone at Pennsylvania Hospital, because she had already been asked to resign from her residency there, asked with the particular politeness that institutions use when they mean something much less polite, and there was no one left there who would have cared. The dark past she carried was not criminal, it was professional. She had fought, loudly and in writing, for a patient whose treatment she believed to be wrong, a woman named Eliza Marsh, 42 years old, whose surgeon had decided her symptoms were hysteria and whose condition was in fact a perforated ulcer. Theresa had been right. She had also been right too loudly, in front of too many people, in a hospital where women physicians were tolerated only when they were quiet about being right. Eliza Marsh had survived because Theresa had forced the issue. Theresa's position at Pennsylvania Hospital had not survived the same force. So she had come west, which was what people did in 1882 when the East had no more room for them, and she had arrived in Caldwell Valley with a physician's bag, and she was beginning to understand, no plan to leave. "I'm Theresa Lockhart," she said to Ruth Calder. "I answered the notice." Ruth Calder's face broke into a smile of such genuine relief that it was almost painful to see. "Lord be thanked," she said. "Come inside. I'll make coffee and tell you everything." Everything, as it turned out, took 2 hours and involved 3 cups of coffee and a substantial portion of Ruth Calder's backstory, which Theresa absorbed with the focused attention she brought to any case history. Caldwell Valley had been a mining settlement for 12 years. It had never had a permanent physician. It had had a traveling doctor named Ellsworth who came through once a month, or had, until Ellsworth died of typhoid in the winter of 1881, and no one had replaced him. In the 8 months since Ellsworth's death, the valley had made do with Ruth Calder's considerable home remedy knowledge, the patience of the miners' wives, and prayer. There had been 2 deaths that Ruth believed a physician could have prevented. She said this with a flatness that contained enormous grief. "Who sent the notice to Philadelphia?" Theresa asked. Ruth looked at her with an expression that flickered briefly, with something she was choosing not to say. "Someone who knew we needed help," she said. "Someone who has been watching this valley slowly bleed for a long time." Theresa filed that answer away, incomplete, evasive, carrying the shape of a secret, and moved on to the practical questions. Where would she live? Ruth had a back room in the store. Where would she practice? There was a building at the end of the main street, formerly a land office, that had been empty for 2 years. What would she be paid? The mining company that owned most of the valley, a concern called Caldwell Consolidated, had agreed to contribute $20 a month toward a physician's salary, and the community would supplement it with what they could manage. It was not much. It was enough. She set up her practice in the former land office in the first week, scrubbing floors and whitewashing walls and building examination tables out of lumber she bought at the general store and assembled herself, which caused considerable comment from the men who watched her through the window. She had grown up in a house where things were built and fixed and maintained, not hired out, and she had her father's practical hands along with his physician's bag, and she did not particularly care what the watching men thought. The first patient came on a Thursday, 5 days after her arrival. A child named Emmett Duval, 7 years old, with a fever that had been building for 4 days. His mother carried him in wrapped in a blanket, terrified. Theresa examined him, identified a severe throat infection, and began treatment. Within 3 days, Emmett Duval was chasing chickens behind his mother's house, and she had, without quite deciding to, established herself as the valley's physician. She saw Harvey Brenner for the first time that same week, though she did not know his name yet. He was standing in the street outside her building when she came out to empty a bucket of wash water. He was taller than most of the men in the valley, with dark hair that had started to silver at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been through weather and come out the other side still intact, which she later understood was an almost exact description of his life. He was dressed in working clothes, canvas trousers and a flannel shirt, with a hat pulled low against the May sun. He held a horse's reins loosely in one hand with the ease of someone who had been doing it since childhood. He was looking at the sign she had nailed above the door. It read, Theresa Lockhart, MD Physician and Surgeon, Office HOURS 812 and 26, Emergencies AT any hour. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. She was standing with a bucket of gray water and a neutral expression, waiting to see what he would do. He did nothing at first. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a way that could have been acknowledgement or could have been dismissal. She could not quite read it, and he turned and walked his horse down the street. She threw the water into the dust. She went inside. Ruth Calder, when asked that evening, identified him from Theresa's description with the promptness of someone who had been expecting the question. Harvey Brenner. He owned the valley's one working cattle ranch, the Bar H, 4 miles north of town on the river. He had been in Caldwell Valley for 9 years, arriving in 1873 with 2 horses and a determination that had impressed everyone and scared most people. And he had built the Bar H from nothing over the following years, buying land when he could and leasing when he couldn't, and working in a way that the valley's older residents described with the particular reverence reserved for things that were slightly terrifying. Is he difficult? Theresa asked. Ruth's pause was answer enough. Harvey is protective, she said, choosing the word with care. Of the valley, of the people in it. He takes it personally when things go wrong here. Does he object to my being here? Another pause. He might have some concerns, Ruth said, about qualifications, about whether a woman physician is appropriate for a mining settlement. I wouldn't take it personally, Theresa. He'll come around. Theresa thought about the way he had looked at her sign. She did not think it was quite that simple. There was something in his expression she had not been able to read, and she had spent her career learning to read things quickly. She was right that it was not simple. She discovered this approximately 2 weeks after her arrival, when Harvey Brenner appeared in her office doorway at 7 in the morning before hours, with his hat in his hand, which she already understood was his version of a formal gesture, and asked if she had a moment. She had a moment. He sat in the chair across from her desk. He was clean-shaved and had clearly come into town with intention, which meant this was something he had thought about before coming. He turned his hat in his hands twice. Then he set it on his knee and looked at her directly. I want to understand something, he said, about why you're here. I'm here because the valley needed a physician, she said. Philadelphia is a long way to come for a job, he said. Yes, she agreed. He waited for more. She offered nothing more. After a moment he nodded slightly, accepting that she was not going to make this easy. I'm not against having a doctor in the valley, he said. I want that clear. What are you against? She asked. I'm against someone being here for the wrong reasons, he said. Against someone coming out here on some kind of adventure, some idea about the frontier, and leaving when it stops being interesting. The valley has had that happen before, with the last doctor, with teachers, with other people who came with intentions. He stopped. He seemed to be editing himself. People here have started to trust you. That's fast. And if you leave in 6 months when the winter starts to seem real and the supply wagon stops coming through, Mr. Brenner, she said. He stopped talking. I have nowhere else to go, she said. It was the most honest thing she could have said, and she watched it land on him, watched something shift in his expression. Whatever you have heard or imagined about my reasons for being here, I can assure you that the East has nothing left for me, and I arrived in this valley with a physician's bag and no plan to leave. None. So you can either be useful, which I suspect you are quite capable of, or you can sit across from me being suspicious, which wastes both our time." His jaw tightened, his expression did something complicated, and then very slowly the corner of his mouth moved in what was almost not quite but almost a smile. "Fair enough," he said. He picked up his hat, he stood. "I apologize for wasting your time." "You haven't wasted it yet," she said. "You've been here less than 5 minutes." He looked at her. This time something in his eyes was different, warmer and more wary at once, as though warmth was something he had learned to be careful about. He nodded once. He left. She sat at her desk for a moment after he had gone, her hands folded in front of her, and understood that this man was going to matter to her. She did not know how or in what form, but the understanding was clear and immediate and entirely unwelcome, because she had come to Caldwell Valley to practice medicine and build something real, and she had not accounted for complications of this particular kind. The Valley, however, was not interested in her accounting. Over the following weeks, she found Harvey Brenner's presence in her life assembling itself without her permission. He sent 2 of his ranch hands to help her reinforce the back wall of her office, which had developed a troubling lean. He left a side of beef at the general store with a note saying it was for the medicine pantry, not for her, specifically, because she had been treating ranch hands who could not pay her in cash. He did not come with it himself. He did not make it personal. She found this maddening in a way she could not entirely articulate, so she focused on her practice instead. By the end of her 2nd month, she was seeing 20 to 30 patients a week, minors with injuries, children with fevers and infections, women with complications of pregnancy and childbirth, and the grinding exhaustion of frontier life, older settlers with the accumulated damage of decades of hard work. She was busy in a way that made her whole, her training made whole, her hands and mind working together toward something that mattered, the way it had briefly in Philadelphia before everything had fractured. She delivered her first baby in Caldwell Valley on a Saturday night in late May, a boy named Robert Kellerman, who arrived into the world in a difficult presentation that Theresa resolved through a combination of skill, patience, and the kind of focused calm that is sometimes the only thing that saves a life. The mother, Clara Kellerman, grabbed her hand afterward and said she would never be able to thank her enough, and Theresa held onto that hand and said she already had. She walked home through the pre-dawn darkness with her bag and the smell of birth and blood still on her hands, and she passed the end of Main Street where Harvey Brenner's horse was tied in front of the saloon, which told her he had been in town overnight, which was unusual for a man who ran a ranch 4 miles away, and she did not stop, but she noticed it. She noticed later that he had been in town that particular night because one of the miners had come to the Bar H with news that Clara Kellerman had gone into difficult labor, and there was no one to help, and Harvey had ridden in to find a solution and found instead that Theresa was already there, already working, and had tied his horse and waited in the pre-dawn dark for news. She learned this from Ruth 2 days later. She sat with it for a long time. In early June, the mining operation above the valley had an accident. A support structure in the main shaft gave way, and 3 men were trapped and 2 were injured, and the injured men were brought down to her practice in a wagon that arrived at 7 in the morning with a kind of desperate noise that she heard from the back room before the door opened. One of the injured men was Clyde Purcell, whose left arm had been crushed. She worked on Clyde first because his injuries were most immediately life-threatening. The other man, a younger miner named Dennis Vance, who had a head wound and a probable concussion, she assessed quickly and determined could wait. She sent Ruth's nephew to fetch her supplies and she cleared the back room and she began, and she was 40 minutes into surgery when Harvey Brenner kicked open the door. She had not known he was coming. She had not sent for him. She learned later that he had heard about the accident at the Bar H and ridden in immediately, because 2 of the trapped men were his former ranch hands who had gone to work in the mine when the cattle operation had a lean year, and because, she understood without being told, this was his valley, and when it bled he showed up. He held the lantern where it was most useful. He followed her quiet instructions without question. He was steady in a way that surgery required and not everyone could manage. No flinching, no looking away, no offers of unnecessary conversation. When she needed a second pair of hands, she told him where to put them and he put them there. Clyde Purcell lived. She saved the arm. When it was done, she stood with her hands still in the wash basin and let the cold water run over them. And she was aware of Harvey Brenner standing 6 feet away in the pale morning light coming through the surgery window, watching her with an expression she could not catalog and had not seen on his face before. "You are extraordinary," he said. The words came out with a directness that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, as though he had not decided to say them and they had escaped without permission. She turned from the basin. She dried her hands on a clean cloth. "I was trained," she said. "There are things you can do when you've been trained that look like more than they are." "No," he said. "I've seen men work on other men in the field. I've seen what competence looks like. What you just did was different." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was very clear, coming in from the east window, and it put his face into a kind of relief that showed the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples, and the steadiness that was either strength or its excellent imitation. And she thought that in Philadelphia she had known men who had positions and names and salaries, and none of them had looked like this, like they had been tested and had not broken. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went further than was probably wise. Something passed between them. Neither of them spoke to acknowledge it. The moment folded itself into the ordinary morning, and she went back to check on Clyde Purcell, and Harvey left to see about the men still trapped in the mine, and the valley carried on. But things had changed, and they both knew it. The following week, he came to her office in the late afternoon when she had finished hours, and he did not have his hat in his hand this time. He had come from the ranch still in his working clothes, and he knocked twice on the doorframe and looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is committed to seeing it through regardless of how it goes. "I'd like to take you out to see the valley," he said. "Not as I don't mean formally. I mean there are parts of it you haven't seen yet, and if you're going to be here you should know it, all of it." She had 3 charts to complete. She was tired in the pleasant way that came from a day of useful work. She put down her pen. When she asked, "Tomorrow morning," he said, "if you can spare the time." "I'll arrange for Ruth to manage any urgent calls," she said. "What should I wear?" He looked at her traveling clothes, which were practical in Pennsylvania, and said, "Boots, if you have them." "And a coat. The ridge in the morning is cold." She had boots. She wore them the next morning when he appeared at the general store with 2 horses, his own, a dark bay gelding named Copper, and a borrowed mare for her, brown and patient. He handed her the reins with the straightforward assumption that she could ride, which she could, though not with the absolute ease he had. They rode north along the river first, in the cool of the morning, the water running green-brown over polished stones, the willows along the bank just leafed out in their young summer green. He was quiet in the way of someone who knows a landscape well enough to let it speak. She watched the way he looked at the land, proprietary but not possessive, the way you might look at something you loved rather than something you owned. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. 9 years in this valley," he said. "Before that, 7 years in Texas, and before that," he stopped briefly. "Before that, the war." She did not need to ask which war. He had the look that men who had been in it carried in the bones of their faces if they had been young enough and the war had been bad enough. "How old were you?" she asked. 17 when I enlisted, 19 when it ended." He said it without particular emotion, just the fact of it, set down in the space between them like a stone. "I went to Texas after because I needed to go somewhere that wasn't where I'd been. And then here." "And then here," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "This valley, when I first came into it in 1873, it was mostly empty. There was a small settlement at the south end, and the river and the ridges, and nobody had tried to do much with it yet. I rode in on a Tuesday morning and I thought, this is it. This is the place I can build something that will last." "And has it?" she asked. "Lasted?" He looked at her. There was something in the question he heard that she had not necessarily put there, or perhaps she had. "So far," he said. "Ask me again in 20 years." She smiled. The smile happened before she could decide whether it was wise. He looked away, but not before she saw something in his face that was warm and carefully contained. They rode up to the ridge in the late morning, following a path through the ponderosa pines that he clearly knew without having to look for it. The ridge was 500 feet above the valley floor, and when they came out on top and the whole valley was below them, the river thread, the settlement's cluster of rooftops, the green strips of irrigated garden, the gray-brown geometric wounds of the mining operation on the northern slope, she drew a breath. "I see why you stayed," she said. "Most people see it from below," he said. "From below, it's just another rough settlement. From up here, it's a place," she said. He nodded. "Exactly," he said. "It's a place." They sat on the ridge for a while and looked at the valley, and she understood that he was giving her something, not the view, which was just geography, but the perspective, which was what transformed geography into meaning. He was showing her why this place mattered. He was, she thought, making an argument that she had not asked for and he had perhaps not intended to make, which was that she should stay, and that staying was worth something. On the way back down, his horse stumbled on a loose stone, and he caught him easily, sure-handed, and the horse gathered himself and went on. She watched his hands on the reins, large, scarred across the knuckles, deft, and thought about those hands holding a lantern over a surgery table at 4 in the morning, and something in her chest made a decision she was not asked to ratify. They rode back to town in the early afternoon. At the general store, he helped her down from the mare briefly, just a steadying hand at her elbow, and the contact was brief enough to be proper and long enough to be significant. "Thank you," she said. "I should have done it sooner," he said. He meant the ride, the introduction to the valley, but something in the way he said it suggested he might have meant something else too. She went inside. She stood for a moment in Ruth's back room with her coat still on, and thought about forbidden things, which was what desire was when you had come somewhere to work, and had not accounted for the possibility of wanting something personal from the landscape. June deepened into a proper summer. The valley was dry and hot in the afternoons, and her practice filled with heat-related ailments and the continuing parade of mining injuries and the summer illnesses of children. She delivered 2 more babies, both boys, and treated a case of scarlet fever that frightened her badly until it resolved, and set 4 broken bones, and removed a tooth from the county commissioner that the man had been suffering from for 3 months because he was too proud to come to a woman doctor. The commissioner, whose name was Franklin Jessup, was the man Harvey had referred to when he kicked open the surgery door during Clyde Purcell's operation, and after his tooth came out and his suffering ended, he was significantly less concerned about her licensing credentials. "I still have concerns," Jessup told her 3 days after the extraction when he could speak properly again and had come to her office to assert them. "About the propriety of the situation. A woman of your age, unmarried, practicing medicine among a population of rough men, Mr. Jessup," she said, with the patience she reserved for institutional obstruction. "I have been treating rough men since my 2nd year of medical school. I assure you the roughness has not proved problematic." "It isn't a question of roughness," he said, uncomfortable. "It's a question of, I know what question it is," she said. "And the answer is that the people of this valley have needed a physician for 8 months, and before that had inadequate care for 12 years, and I am that physician, and I intend to continue being that physician regardless of whether my continuing to do so fits your notion of propriety. Good afternoon, Mr. Jessup." She heard later from Ruth that Jessup had gone from her office to the saloon, and from the saloon to Harvey Brenner, and that Harvey had listened to Jessup's concerns for approximately 2 minutes, and then told him, with economy, that the valley had needed a physician for years and now it had one, and if Jessup caused problems for that physician, he would find himself making those problems alone. Theresa, when this was relayed to her, sat with it in the complicated way she was sitting with most things involving Harvey Brenner, grateful, warmed, and faintly alarmed at the warmth. It was Ruth who brought it into the open, because Ruth had known Theresa for less than 2 months but had the instincts of someone who had watched human nature for 6 decades. "You know he watched for your light in the surgery window for the 2 hours you were working on Clyde Purcell," Ruth said one evening in the conversational tone of someone establishing a fact. "Before he came in, he was standing in the street." "You told me he was in the saloon," Theresa said. "He was, for about 20 minutes. Then he came out and stood in the street." Theresa put down the cup she was holding. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are a very smart woman who is working very hard at not noticing something obvious," Ruth said. "And because Harvey Brenner is a man who has not let himself want anything personal for a long time, and seeing him start to it's something worth noticing." "It's complicated," Theresa said. "Everything worth anything is complicated," Ruth said comfortably. "That's not an argument, it's just a fact of life." Theresa said nothing. Ruth poured more coffee. Outside, the June night was clear and full of stars, the way the desert night was when no moon competed with them, and the valley was very quiet. "What happened to him?" Theresa asked. "Before here, in Texas, and before." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He had a wife," she said, "in Texas. Her name was Meredith. She died of fever in 1872. They had been married 2 years. She said it gently but without softening the fact. He came here after. He has been here 9 years, and he has been careful since, about wanting things." Theresa sat with that for a long time after Ruth went to bed. She thought about a man who had been 19 when a war ended, and who had gone to Texas and built a life and lost it, and gone further west and built another life, and had been careful for 9 years. She thought about how being careful could be protection, and how it could be its own kind of damage. She thought about her own carefulness, which had a different shape but the same source, loss, and the fear of more loss. She thought these things, and then she went to bed and did not sleep very well, and in the morning she saw patients and did not think about Harvey Brenner at all, which was a project that required more effort than she would have admitted. In late June, a man came to the valley who changed things. His name was Aldous Crane, and he arrived from Carson City with a briefcase and a suit that had not been designed for the frontier, and a letter of introduction from the Nevada Territory's Medical Licensing Board. He presented himself at her office on a Monday morning with the smooth, careful manner of someone who has been sent to do something unpleasant, and has dressed up the unpleasantness in courtesy. He was there, he explained, to investigate her credentials and her practice. A formal complaint had been filed with the licensing board. He could not tell her by whom, alleging that she was practicing medicine without proper territorial licensure, and that several of her procedures, including surgery performed in a non-accredited setting, were conducted in violation of territorial medical regulations. She looked at him across her desk. She was very calm. "My degree is from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania," she said. "Class of 1879. I can show you my diploma." "That is not in question," Crane said carefully. "The question is whether your Pennsylvania credentials extend to practice in Nevada Territory, and whether the facilities and procedures you have employed meet territorial standards. Nevada Territory has no accredited hospital within 80 miles of this settlement," she said. "The nearest territorial facility is in Elko. Are you suggesting that the residents of Caldwell Valley should travel 80 miles for emergency surgical care?" "I'm suggesting that the regulations were written for established cities with established medical infrastructure," she said, still calm, still precise. "They were not written for frontier settlements with 400 residents and no alternatives. I am the alternative, Mr. Crane. I have been the alternative for 2 months, and in those 2 months 1 miner kept his arm, 3 infants were delivered safely, a child recovered from scarlet fever, and 67 other patients received care they would not otherwise have had. If your complaint is that I have done these things without the proper paperwork, then I suggest you take that complaint back to Carson City and explain to the licensing board what they would prefer I should have done instead." Crane blinked. He had clearly not expected this. He had perhaps expected timidity, the apologetic femininity that institutions used as a measuring stick for women who had gotten into places where institutions were not sure they should be. The complaint also alleges, he said more carefully now, certain improprieties in your personal conduct relative to your professional position. Specifically regarding what? She asked, and now her voice had something under the calm, something sharp. He was reluctant. Regarding your relationship with certain prominent individuals in the valley, the allegation is that you are trading medical services for personal consideration. She understood what he was saying. She felt the bottom of her stomach fall away. Say plainly what you mean, she said. The complaint alleges that you have entered into an inappropriate personal arrangement with Mr. Harvey Brenner of the Bar H Ranch, and that this arrangement has compromised the professional independence of your practice. She was on her feet. She had not decided to stand. She had simply found herself standing. There is no such arrangement, she said. Mr. Brenner has referred patients to my practice and has on one occasion assisted during an emergency surgical procedure. That is the entirety of our professional interaction. The allegation is false, Mr. Crane, and whoever made it has made it either out of ignorance or out of malice, and if it is malice, I intend to find out why. Crane looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had arrived expecting a problem and found instead a wall. I'll need to verify your credentials formally, he said, and inspect your facilities. You are welcome to do both, she said. I will make everything available to you. And I suggest you start with the facilities, because I guarantee they will meet or exceed anything the territory's regulations require for a practice of this type. She showed him everything. She was meticulous and thorough, because thoroughness was its own argument. Crane inspected and noted and asked questions, and she answered all of them. By the end of the afternoon, she could see that he had not found what he'd come expecting to find. When he left, she sat at her desk for a long time. Then she went to find Harvey Brenner. He was at the livery stable, which was where she'd been told he often stopped on his way in and out of town. She found him there in conversation with the liveryman, and he turned when she appeared in the doorway with a hat in her hand. She had taken to carrying hats against the sun, and something in her expression made his expression change immediately. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it: Crane, the complaint, the credentials investigation, the allegation about personal impropriety. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched the expression move from concern to focus to something harder and colder. The allegation about us, she said, and felt strange using that pronoun because it implied a thing that did not quite yet have a name, will do damage to my practice if it is allowed to stand. I need you to understand that. I know, he said. I also need to know if you have any idea who filed the complaint. He was quiet for a moment. The quiet was not evasion. It was the pause of a man who is telling the truth carefully. I have a suspicion, he said. There are 2 men who have been pushing to bring in a physician from Carson City for the last 8 months. Men with financial ties to the Caldwell Consolidated Mining Company, who would prefer a doctor they can manage. You came from outside their selection process. You were brought in by Ruth's notice without their approval. You have been more independent than they would have liked. Is one of those men Franklin Jessup? She asked. He met her eyes. Yes, she absorbed this. It fit. Jessup's visit to her office, his concerns about propriety, his subsequent silence when she'd expected more trouble from him, silence she now understood while this other approach was being arranged. It's my practice they're targeting, she said. Not you. They're using you to get at me, he said. I have land they want, property along the river that Caldwell Consolidated has been trying to acquire for 3 years. They think if they discredit you, they discredit my support of your being here, and they weaken my position in the valley. He said it bluntly, with an anger he was holding firmly under control. I'm sorry. You came here to practice medicine, and you've been caught in something that has nothing to do with medicine. It has everything to do with medicine, she said. My practice is the target. My credentials, my methods, my presence here. It matters. Yes, he said. It does. They stood in the cool shadow of the livery stable, and the day was very hot outside, and the valley was bright and dry in the late afternoon sun, and she felt the weight of the last 2 months, the work, the patience, the accumulated small victories, Clyde Purcell's arm, Clara Kellerman's son, the scarlet fever child who had not died, as a thing worth defending with her entire self. "What do I do?" she asked. He looked at her. She saw in that look something that she had been watching assemble itself for weeks, something warm and precise and very intentional, like a man putting a foundation under something he has decided to build. "You let me go talk to some people," he said. "And you go back to your practice and you document everything, every patient, every procedure, every outcome so thoroughly that when Crane goes back to Carson City he has nothing to work with, and you let me handle Jessup." "I can handle Jessup myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm asking you to let me." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the last 9 years of his being careful. She thought about what it meant that he was not being careful right now. "All right," she said. "But tell me what you find out." "I will," he said. "You have my word." She believed him. She was not entirely sure she should, but she believed him, and belief, she had found, was frequently wiser than its alternatives. She went back to her office and began the documentation project with the systematic thoroughness that her training had given her. Every patient record detailed, every procedure noted with outcome and date and witness where applicable. Clyde Purcell's case took 3 pages. By 9 o'clock she had filled a new ledger nearly halfway. At 10 o'clock, Harvey knocked on the door of the general store, where she was working at Ruth's kitchen table because her office lamp had run out of oil. She let him in. He sat across the table from her and told her what he had found. He had spoken to 2 people, the deputy clerk at the county office, who was a scrupulously honest man named Ward, and a former employee of Caldwell Consolidated who had recently left the company's employ under unhappy circumstances, and was, as a result, willing to talk. The complaint to the licensing board had been filed by a man named Chester Aldgate, who was a managing partner in Caldwell Consolidated. Jessup had delivered the letter personally to the territorial mail writer. The complaint was one piece of a larger strategy to force Harvey to sell his river land by making the valley ungovernable for anyone he supported, including the physician he had backed. It was, Theresa said when he finished, the most petty and elaborate betrayal of public trust she had encountered outside of Philadelphia's hospital board. "What can you do about it?" she asked. "Ward has the original complaint document," Harvey said. "He says there are irregularities in how it was filed, procedural ones. If those are brought to the licensing board's attention through proper channels, Crane's investigation has no legal standing." He paused. "It won't make Jessup or Aldgate stop. But it buys time and it removes the immediate threat." "What do Jessup and Aldgate want with your land?" she asked. "The river," he said simply. "If they control the water rights on that section of the Humboldt Fork, they control the entire valley's water supply. Every rancher and farmer and household here would be dependent on Caldwell Consolidated for water. They could price people out, force small operations to sell, consolidate." He said it evenly. "I have refused to sell for 3 years. They are escalating." She looked at him across Ruth's kitchen table in the lamplight and understood the scope of what he had been carrying. This valley, the place he had ridden into on a Tuesday morning in 1873, and decided was his purpose, was under active threat from the same forces that operated everywhere in the West in 1882, the forces that turned land and water into instruments of control rather than foundations of life. "You have been fighting this alone," she said. "I've had allies," he said, but no one who she stopped. She was not sure how to finish the sentence properly. "No," he said, and there was a gentleness in the word that answered the unfinished question. "Not for a long time." She was aware of the table between them and the lamplight and Ruth sleeping in the next room and all the ordinary barriers that she had been using, not dishonestly, but as a postponement of something that had been building since the first morning she had seen him in the street looking at her sign. She pushed a sheet of paper across the table toward him, the patient documentation ledger, open to a page. "Read that," she said. He read it. It was Clyde Purcell's case record. 2 pages of precise medical documentation, every detail of the procedure, every decision made and why, every outcome measured and noted. He read it slowly, with the attention he brought to everything. When he finished, he looked up at her. "You saved his arm," he said. "I did what I was trained to do," she said. And then, because she was tired and it was late and the lamplight was amber and kind and she had been postponing long enough, "But this valley is where I am going to do it. This is where I belong. Whatever Jessup and Aldgate and licensing boards and commissioners try to do, this is where I'm staying." The word landed between them with a weight she had not entirely planned. Harvey looked at her for a long, steady moment. His hands, folded on the table, were very still. "The valley has needed you for years," he said. "Before you came, all those years without anyone." He stopped. He started again, more carefully. "I've been telling people that, since you arrived, that the valley needed you, but I think another stop. I think I may have also been telling myself something else." She waited. "Something more personal," he said, "than the valley." She had been waiting for this. She had known it was coming and had been both eager for it and afraid of it, for all the complicated reasons that loss and rebuilding and the frontier made into daily currency. "Harvey," she said, and using his given name felt like a small, significant thing. "I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you've been here 8 weeks and you have a practice to establish, and the last thing you need is me." "I didn't say it was too soon," she said. He stopped. She met his eyes across the table and held them with the directness she had brought to everything in this valley, because she had learned that out here, directness was the only language that saved time and possibly lives. "I said your name," she said. "That's all. I think you are a man who says things carefully because he has learned the cost of carelessness. And I think I am a woman who has spent 8 weeks deciding whether something I was feeling was real or just the frontier making everything feel larger than it is. And," he said, his voice was very quiet, "and it's real," she said, "for all the good and the complicated and the frightening that means." He exhaled slowly. "Good and complicated and frightening," he said. "That's about right." She did not reach across the table because Ruth was sleeping 20 feet away and because some things should happen in their proper order, and the proper order of this particular thing began with honesty and with time, and with a valley that needed both of them in different ways. "Let's address the licensing problem first," she said, "and Jessup and Aldgate, and then we'll see." He nodded. She saw in his face the particular relief of someone who has said a true thing and not had it destroyed by the saying. "Then we'll see," he agreed. The battle with Caldwell Consolidated took 6 weeks and was neither simple nor entirely clean. Harvey worked with Ward, the deputy clerk, to document the procedural irregularities in the complaint filing and bring them formally to Aldous Crane's attention before the investigator left for Carson City. Crane was, she had concluded, not a bad man. He was a bureaucratic man, which was different. And bureaucratic men responded to procedural arguments because procedure was the only language their world was built in. The procedural argument was good enough. Crane departed without filing a formal adverse finding, though he noted in his report that her facilities required an official inspection within the year, which she accepted as reasonable and prepared to pass. Aldgate and Jessup were more difficult. They did not stop their pressure on Harvey's land, and in late July they brought in a lawyer from Carson City named Pierce, who began filing legal challenges to the water rights documentation on Harvey's river property. Harvey met this with his own lawyer, a man named Holloway, based in Elko, who turned out to be as stubborn as Aldgate's team was aggressive. She focused on her practice, because focusing on her practice was both what she was here to do and what kept her from consuming herself in anger at the forces arrayed against the valley. She had understood injustice in Philadelphia, the kind that operated through institutional courtesy and polite exclusion, and this kind was more open and more muscular. But it was the same essential thing, power attempting to consume what it could not control. She said this to Harvey one evening in late July, sitting on the steps of her office in the cooling evening air, which was one of the courtship rituals they had developed without discussing it. The evening conversation, on the steps or at the kitchen table or occasionally riding along the river road, regular and quiet and building something she felt in her bones as solid and as certain as the canyon walls. "You've dealt with this before," he said. It was not quite a question. "In Philadelphia," she said. The hospital board. Men who had decided that women physicians were acceptable as a theoretical proposition and not in practice. When I insisted on practice, she shrugged. "I insisted on my resignation." "Is that why you left?" "That's why I was willing to leave," she said. "I had nowhere to go from there that would have been forward, so I went west." She looked out at the street, at the valley beyond it, at the ridge line black against the darkening sky. "I have never once regretted it." He was sitting beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "Almost." "The patient," he said. "The one you fought for, did she survive?" She turned to look at him. He had remembered that from weeks ago. "She survived," Theresa said. "Eliza Marsh. She was 42 and she had a husband and 3 children, and she was about to die of a perforated ulcer while someone explained to her that her symptoms were hysteria. She survived because I made enough noise at the right moment." "You would do it again," he said. "Every time," she said. He looked at her with that steady warmth she had been watching accumulate for weeks. "Every patient you have treated here," he said, "has said the same thing afterward, that you were thorough, that you were honest, that you stayed." "Staying is easy," she said, "when there's a reason." The evening had gone deep blue around them. Down the street, the saloon's lamp was orange. Somewhere in the mining camp on the ridge, a man was playing a harmonica badly and with great feeling. Harvey turned on the step to face her more fully, and his expression had the quality of something finally decided. "Theresa," he said. "Yes," she said. She was not answering a question. She was acknowledging that she heard him use her name, which was its own answer. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and calloused and very certain, and her hand in his was a declarative sentence after months of careful subordinate clauses. "I don't want to wait for Jessup and Aldgate to be resolved," he said. "I've been waiting to say this I've been waiting." "Then say it," she said. "I want to court you," he said, "properly, with intention, because I intend to ask you to marry me eventually when we've had time to. I don't want to move faster than you're comfortable with, and I understand that you have a practice and your own life here and that." "Harvey," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said, "to the courting, and I'll tell you now, since you told me your intention, I think I will say yes, when you ask, eventually." He looked at her for a moment as though testing whether she meant it. She did not change her expression. She meant it. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, and he smiled properly, fully, the first time she had seen it without reservation, and it transformed his face in the way that genuine happiness transforms faces that have learned to be careful, which is to say completely. "Good," he said. He sounded a little undone by it. She found this enormously endearing. They sat on the steps for another half hour in the cooling evening, their hands still linked, talking about nothing in particular, the water rights case, a patient she was concerned about, a calf at the bar that had given him trouble that morning, the question of whether the general store needed to order more carbolic acid before winter. And all of it was ordinary and all of it was new, because everything ordinary becomes new when you have someone's hand in yours. The legal battle resolved in September. Holloway found a documented precedent in the territorial land records that established the water rights on Harvey's river section clearly and without ambiguity in his favor. The precedent had existed since 1868 but had been buried in the county records under a filing error, and Ward, who was clearly a man of formidable patience, had found it. Aldgate and Jessup, faced with the documented precedent and an increasingly unsympathetic community. The valley's residents had been watching the situation and had their own thoughts about corporations trying to control their water supply, withdrew the legal challenge. Jessup resigned from the county commission 6 weeks later, citing health concerns, which was the frontier's polite way of acknowledging a defeat. Caldwell Consolidated was not finished being powerful, and Theresa knew it, and Harvey knew it, but the immediate threat was past, and the valley had survived it intact. The evening that Holloway telegraphed the news of the settled water rights, Harvey rode into town and came directly to her office, and when she came out to meet him in the street, he had the unguarded expression of someone who has set down a very heavy load. He took both her hands. They were standing in Main Street in the early evening in September, with half the valley probably watching, and neither of them cared. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "Ruth told me an hour ago." She squeezed his hands. "Are you all right?" "Better than I've been in 3 years," he said. He looked at her, the direct, warm, certain look she had learned like a language. "Theresa." "I know," she said again softly. "I'm going to ask you anyway," he said. "Because I said I would, and I meant it, and I am—" He stopped. He was not a man for speeches, and she loved that about him, the way his language stayed honest by staying simple. "I love you," he said. "I have been falling in love with you since you told me to hold a lantern and make myself useful. Will you marry me?" The street around them was quiet in the way that frontier streets go quiet when something is about to happen. The evening light was going amber and long. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He let out a slow breath. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong and a little faster than usual, and she thought, "This is what I came here for. Not just the medicine, not just the valley, not just the work, this too, this particular human thing, unexpected and true and worth every complicated mile." Someone down the street, Ruth, she would later determine, started applauding. The sound was small and happy in the evening air. They were married on a Saturday in October, 2 weeks after the water rights case closed, in the one church Caldwell Valley possessed, a small frame building that smelled of pine wood and candle wax and the particular gravity of occasions. Ruth stood with her. Harvey's foreman at the bar, a steady man named Garrett, stood with him. The minister read from Scripture with appropriate ceremony. Harvey said his vows with the directness he brought to everything true, looking at her with the full weight of his attention and his intention, and she said hers back in kind. She wore the best dress she had brought from Philadelphia, which was deep blue, and she carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that one of the miner's daughters had made her, carefully and with great pride. When the minister said husband and wife and Harvey kissed her, the church erupted in noise, cheering and feet stamping on the floorboards, and Ruth crying with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for this for months. They moved into the bar together. She kept her practice in town, riding in 4 days a week, and Harvey arranged for one of the ranch's spare horses to be available at the livery for her use. It was a practical arrangement, negotiated between them with the practical directness that characterized everything they did together, but it was also, as she understood on the first morning, she rode into town for patient hours with the ranch behind her, and the valley spread out in the autumn light, and the knowledge that she would ride back to him in the evening deeply and fundamentally happy. The winter of 1882 was hard. The high desert winters were not the wet cold of the East, but a dry, grinding cold that came down off the mountains and sat on the valley for months. And she was busy with winter illnesses and frostbite, and the particular desperation of settlements where food stores had to last until the supply roads reopened in spring. She treated pneumonia, which terrified her because she knew what it could take, and she managed 2 cases of it through the worst weeks of January with her full skill and a great deal of prayer, and both patients recovered. Harvey watched her work with a steady admiration he expressed through action rather than words, making sure the ranch's food stores shared with families in the settlement who were short, riding out himself to bring in a woman whose children were sick when the snow made the road impassable for a wagon, sitting with her in the evenings when she was tired and needed to talk through a patient case, and could not talk to anyone else about it. One January night, when the wind was coming off the ridge with a sound like something being broken, she sat across from him at the kitchen table of the bar with her patient ledger open and her head in her hands, because she was afraid about one of the pneumonia cases. A woman of 50 named Josephine Alcott who had taken a turn for the worse that afternoon, and she could not stop running the permutations of what might happen. Harvey moved around the table and sat beside her. He did not say anything. He put his arm around her and let her be afraid in an organized way, which is what she needed, and she understood in that moment that this was what partnership actually looked like, not the absence of fear or difficulty, but the presence of someone steady when the fear and difficulty came. "What does she need?" he asked after a while. "More time," she said. "She needs more time than I know how to give her." "What can you give her?" "Everything I have," she said. "I have been giving everything I have." "Then you've done what's possible," he said. "And that's what she has, what's possible. And tomorrow you go back and you give her everything again." She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. "You make it sound straightforward," she said. "I know it isn't," he said. "But what you do, you save what can be saved. That's all anyone can do." Josephine Alcott, against the odds and apparently through sheer stubbornness that Theresa later credited as a medical factor, turned the corner in February and lived. When spring came and the supply road reopened, she was sitting in the sun outside her house with a quilt over her lap, and she grabbed Theresa's hand when she came for the last follow-up, and said she planned to live to be 80 in honor of the effort. And Theresa laughed with her eyes bright, which was something she had been doing more of since October. Spring of 1883 brought change to Caldwell Valley in the way that spring always brought change, which was with energy and complication. The mining operation expanded, which brought new workers and new families and a noticeable growth in the settlement. The county, responding to the growth, began discussing whether Caldwell Valley ought to have a formal school. Harvey was part of those discussions, as he was part of most things that shaped the valley's future, and Theresa attended several of the community meetings and spoke when she had something useful to say, which was often. She also, in April of 1883, told Harvey something she had suspected for a month and confirmed with her own clinical eye. She told him in the kitchen of the Bar H in the morning, before she rode to town. She was matter-of-fact about it because she was a physician, and there was no mysticism in the biological facts, but she watched his face as the information landed, and she was not matter-of-fact about his face. He went very still. Then something happened in his expression that she had seen once before, the first time she had seen him properly smile, the look of genuine happiness on a face that had learned to be careful but larger this time, larger and more undone, and she felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. "A baby," he said. His voice was not quite its usual self. "In October," she said, "if my calculation is right." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her, very gently but with complete certainty, and she held him back, and the spring morning was bright through the kitchen window, and the valley was green with the snowmelt running in the river, and the Bar H was full of the sounds of a working ranch coming alive for the day. "Are you?" he started. "I'm fine," she said. "Perfectly well. I'm a physician, Harvey. I know what I'm dealing with." "I know," he said. He pulled back enough to look at her. "Are you happy?" "Yes," she said, without any hesitation at all. "Are you?" He answered her by kissing her forehead, which was not his usual kind of answer but was entirely sufficient. She continued her practice through the spring and summer, adjusting as her pregnancy progressed with the same pragmatic flexibility she brought to everything. The valley's women were protective and occasionally overwhelming in their protectiveness, bringing food to the Bar H and checking on her with a frequency she found both touching and slightly comical. Ruth was the most persistent. "You are not one of your patients," Ruth told her firmly one August afternoon. "I know I'm not," Theresa said. "But I know what I'm looking for, which is more than most women have in this position." "Knowing what you're looking for and not worrying about what you find are 2 different things," Ruth said, accurately. Harvey was thorough and unobtrusive in his carefulness about her, which was the kind of carefulness she could accept, not smothering, not treating her as fragile, but present in the specific ways that mattered. The horse was always ready when she needed it. The fire in the office in town was always lit before she arrived on cold mornings, which meant he rose early enough to go to town before she did and come back. And she chose not to comment on this because it was too tender a thing to put into words. Their son was born on October 3rd, 1883, a year and 1 week after their wedding, in the bedroom of the Bar H where Harvey had insisted on having the birth, not in her office, where she would have been half physician and half patient simultaneously. She had trained midwives and assisted at births throughout her career and understood exactly how they went, but understanding a thing intellectually and experiencing it from the other side were two entirely different provinces, and she was grateful for the experienced woman she'd trained, a rancher's wife named Mrs. Fuller who had attended more births than anyone in the valley. Harvey was in the room. She had not required this, he had not asked. He had simply been there, and she had found that she wanted him there, and he had held her hand and been steady in the specific way he was steady when things were hard, the way that made hardness manageable. The boy was born in the early afternoon, dark-haired and emphatic in his initial opinions about the world, which he expressed loudly and immediately. They named him James Robert Brenner for Harvey's father and her own. She held him in the afternoon light of the October bedroom, and felt a wholeness that she had not previously had a category for, complete in a way that she could not have predicted and did not try to define precisely, because some things were more true than they were precise. Harvey sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her, looking at James Robert with the expression of a man who has built something and understands for the first time its full weight and value. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice she had never heard him use before, quieter and more unguarded than his usual voice, stripped of everything cautious. James Robert did not respond in words but looked at his father with the unfocused intensity of the very new, and Harvey looked back with a focused intensity that had been developing for 9 years. "He has your stubbornness," Theresa said. "He has your lungs," Harvey said, which was fair, because the boy was still making his feelings about the world known. She laughed, and the sound filled the October room, and outside the valley was going gold in the afternoon light. The years that followed were full years, built years, years in which things grew and deepened and accumulated into a life. Her practice grew with the valley, which grew steadily through the mid-1880s as the mining operation continued to produce, and the settlement became a proper town. Caldwell Valley incorporated as a township in 1885, with an elected town council that included Harvey in its first session, and a formal mayor in the person of an unlikely candidate named Bill Decker, who was a carpenter, and had been nominated by the miners because he was universally trusted. The school that the community had been discussing since 1883 was built in the autumn of 1884 and opened in January of 1885 with 37 students, and a teacher named Miss Agnes Holt from Sacramento, who turned out to be a woman of remarkable stubbornness and educational conviction who fit the valley like she had been made for it. Theresa's practice eventually outgrew the old land office building. In 1886, the township authorized the construction of a proper medical facility, 2 examination rooms, a surgery, a recovery ward with 6 beds, and an office built next to the church on a lot that Harvey donated from the commercial property he had acquired over the years along Main Street. She stood on the day they broke ground and watched the first shovels go in and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but was the particular emotion of seeing a commitment become stone and mortar. Harvey stood beside her with James Robert 2.5 now, and beginning to have opinions about the world that were articulate if not always reasonable on his shoulders. "You built something real," he said. "We built something real," she said. He took her hand. James Robert, from his elevated position, pointed at a jackrabbit that had appeared at the edge of the lot and announced his intention to catch it, and Harvey set him down with the long-suffering ease of a man who has been running after a toddler for 2 years. Aldous Crane came back to inspect the new facility in the summer of 1886 and was no longer the same bureaucratic obstacle he had once been. He had been promoted within the licensing board, and he had encountered, apparently, enough cases of frontier medical practice to have developed a more nuanced view of what regulations were for. He inspected the new building thoroughly, declared it fully compliant with all territorial standards, and signed the documentation that formally licensed her practice as a certified medical facility. He also apologized, which she had not expected. "The complaint that brought me here initially," he said in the new facility's clean white office, "was made in bad faith. I know that now. I should have seen it more clearly at the time." "You did what your position required," she said. "And then you left without doing damage you could have done. I remember that." He nodded. He seemed relieved to have it said. Chester, Aldgate, and Caldwell Consolidated remained in the valley. They could not be wished away, and the mining operation they ran was economically significant to the community. But the water rights case had established a precedent, and Aldgate, whatever his private feelings, understood that the valley's residents were not going to be moved by pressure of the kind he had tried. He redirected his energies toward the mine itself, which was his actual business, and the relationship between the company and the community settled into a wary practicality. Harvey kept his land. The Bar H continued to grow, adding 3 new grazing sections through the mid-1880s as the cattle business recovered from the lean years and did better than it had before. He hired additional hands, expanded the herd, put new fencing along the river section. He was 40 years old in 1888 and looked, she thought, like a man in the prime of everything he had built. Their second child arrived in 1887, a daughter this time, born in the new medical facility, which was appropriate. She was named Ruth Elizabeth Brenner, and Ruth called her at the announcement, required a chair and a cup of strong tea, and then wept with a thoroughness that she explained afterward was entirely happy. Ruth Elizabeth was, from the first days of her life, a person with very specific preferences and the ability to communicate them, which her mother recognized as an excellent prognosis. She was dark-eyed like Harvey and had Theresa's chin, which Harvey maintained was responsible for the expression of determination she wore when she had decided something. James Robert, as an older brother, was protective in a way that was sometimes more than strictly necessary but always sincere. By the time he was 4 and Ruth Elizabeth was 8 months old, he had developed a habit of sitting beside her basket and reading to her from whatever he had available: picture books, the almanac, the occasional page of the Elko newspaper that Harvey had finished with, and Ruth Elizabeth listened with the attentiveness of someone gathering information. The valley had its injustices, and Theresa acknowledged them fully. She treated the Chinese workers who were employed at the lower end of the mine operation, and who received less pay for more dangerous work, and whose access to medical care had been functionally non-existent before her arrival. She treated them at her practice with the same standard of care she brought to everyone, which was not universally approved of by all members of the community. She had conversations about this, direct ones, uncomfortable ones, and she did not alter her practice. Harvey supported her position on this, as he did on most things where she had a position worth holding. They were not always easy arguments. The community was not monolithic, and there were people in Caldwell Valley who held views about the Chinese workers that she found wrong and said so. But the conversations happened, and over time, some of the views shifted. "You never stop," Harvey said to her one evening after one such conversation, not with criticism. She knew his voice well enough to know the difference, but with a kind of wondering. "Would you want me to?" she said. He considered this with his usual honesty. "No," he said, "I would not." She treated the Paiute people who came occasionally to the valley from the territory to the north, first with wariness from the community, and then, as she treated them with the same careful competence she brought to everyone, and as the outcomes were consistently good, with something closer to acceptance. These encounters were always careful and always respectful, and she learned, in the practical way of a physician who understood that each patient was an authority on their own experience, what she could offer, and what she needed to learn. Her third pregnancy was in 1889, and this time the birth was not simple. She knew it herself from her own assessment in the final weeks, and she had sent a letter to Elko well in advance asking the physician there, a man named Whitmore who had trained in San Francisco and was a colleague she trusted, to come to Caldwell Valley for the birth. He came. Harvey was present again, and Mrs. Fuller and Whitmore. The labor was long and required intervention that she had planned for and communicated clearly, and at the end of it there was a second son, named Thomas Harvey Brenner, who was smaller than either of his siblings at birth but made up for it in the weeks that followed. Theresa, recovering in the bedroom of the Bar H, told Harvey on the third day that she thought Thomas had his character. "God help him," Harvey said, which made her laugh so that her side ached. Thomas was cheerful and curious, and put everything in his mouth well past the age when this was appropriate, and he followed his older brother with the single-minded devotion of someone who has found the person they most want to emulate. James Robert, with the maturity of a 7-year-old, bore this with variable patience. By 1890, Caldwell Valley had a population of over 600, a school with 2 rooms and 2 teachers, a proper town hall, a telegraph office, and her medical facility, which she had now expanded with a second examination room and the addition of a trained nurse, a woman named Caroline Marsh who had come from Salt Lake City and who was, by the assessment of everyone in the valley, exactly as capable as she appeared. Theresa was 35 years old in 1890. She had been in Caldwell Valley for 8 years. She had delivered 62 babies, of whom 4 had not survived, a number she carried with her always, the 4, their names and dates, and had treated uncountable injuries and illnesses and the grinding accumulation of hard lives lived in hard conditions, and she had saved far more than she had lost. She had also built a marriage and a family and a home, which was the other kind of building, less dramatic and more necessary. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary in October of 1889, Harvey had taken her to the ridge, the same ridge where he had taken her the first time, 6 weeks after she arrived, on borrowed horses. They rode up in the October afternoon and stood at the top and looked at the valley below, and it was different from the first time because it was theirs now, both of theirs, in the specific and generous way that a thing becomes yours when you have given yourself to it completely. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. She looked at the valley below, the rooftops, the school, the church, the medical building she could just identify at the south end of Main Street, the river catching the late light, the ridges going purple in the west. "Not once," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood on the ridge in the October light, and the valley was below them with all its reality, its difficulty and its beauty and its ordinary, essential life. "I have something to tell you," he said. She turned to look at him. He was smiling. "The territorial legislature is moving toward statehood," he said. Nevada had been a state since 1864, but the territorial governance structures for counties like theirs were being formalized. The new county boundaries are going to include Caldwell Valley properly. The county seat is going to be 20 miles east. There's going to be a proper county courthouse, a county sheriff, formalized institutions. "That's good," she said, meaning it. Formalization meant stability, and stability meant the things they had built were harder to tear down. "The county medical board," he said, "is going to need a formal medical officer, someone to set standards for the county. I nominated you." She stared at him. "You what?" "I nominated you," he said again, with the straight expression of a man who has done something he is prepared to defend. "At the planning meeting in Elko last month. You have more medical experience in this territory than anyone within 60 miles, and the county needs someone who understands frontier medical practice from the inside, not from a board room in Carson City." She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Aldous Crane and Jessup and the complaint filed in bad faith and the licensing board that had sent someone to investigate her on thin accusations. And she was thinking about 8 years and 62 births and 4 losses and all the cases she could not even count. "It's a political position," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Politics have not always been." "No," he said, "they haven't. But you know how to navigate them, and the county needs someone who does, and who knows what medical practice actually looks like in a place like this." He met her eyes. "You can say no. I'll respect whatever you decide. But I thought you should know that I believe you could do it." She looked at the valley. She had come here with a physician's bag and no plan to leave. She had stayed. She had built. She had fought and lost and fought again and won more than she lost. She had delivered babies and set bones and argued with commissioners and defended the right of every person in the valley to competent medical care regardless of their origins. She had also fallen in love, which she had not planned, and married, which she had not planned, and had 3 children who were currently at the Bar H under the supervision of Garrett's wife, and probably finding some excellent kind of trouble. She had no plan to leave. She never had. "Tell me what it requires," she said. He told her on the ridge in the October light in the precise practical way he did everything. She asked questions. He answered them. The sun went down and the valley went dark below them and the stars came out the way they did in the desert, all at once and absolute. "I'll do it," she said. He pulled her close, right there on the ridge, and kissed her in the cool dark, and she held on to him with both hands and felt the solidity of him and the solidity of the valley and the solidity of the life they had built together. 7 years, he said, against her hair. "More to come," she said. "Many more." They rode back down to the valley in the dark, familiar with the path by now, and the lights of the settlement were below them like a handful of held stars. The county medical officer appointment was confirmed in the spring of 1890, after a review by the newly organized county board that was straightforward, partly because her credentials were genuinely impressive, and partly because Harvey, who had been elected to the county's first planning commission, was not someone the board was inclined to argue with on a matter he had clearly decided. She took the position, and held it with the same thorough, combative, principled approach she brought to everything. She established county standards for medical practice that were more protective of frontier communities than the territory's existing guidelines, and she argued for those standards in Elko and eventually in Carson City, and she won more of those arguments than she lost. She was in Carson City for 3 days in 1891 for a medical board meeting, and she left her practice in Caroline's capable hands and left the children with Harvey. And when she came back on Thursday afternoon, the train pulled into Elko, and she saw Harvey's horse tied at the station, which meant he had ridden the 20 miles to meet her train, which meant he had known her schedule and had simply shown up. He was leaning against the station wall when she came out with her bag, and he looked at her across the platform with the expression that had not changed in 9 years, the warm and certain and specific look that meant her. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. He took her bag. She took his arm instead. They walked to the horses. "How are the children?" she asked. "James Robert is fine. Ruth Elizabeth has decided she is in charge of everything while you're away, which frankly the ranch could use. Thomas ate something unidentified in the yard yesterday and is completely well today, so we're not concerned." She put her hand over her eyes briefly. "What did he eat?" "Garrett thinks it was a beetle," Harvey said. "He's 7 months away from 3 years old. I maintain this is normal." "It is normal," she agreed. "It's disgusting, but it's normal." He helped her mount, and they rode out of Elko in the late afternoon toward the 40 miles of road that led back to the valley, and the desert was amber and gold in the autumn light, and she felt the familiar pull of return, not just to the children and the home, but to the valley itself, the specific gravity of the place she had made her place. "Anything happened while I was gone?" she said. "Josephine Alcott came to see Caroline," he said. "Routine visit." She told Caroline to tell you that she intends to be your most faithful patient until she is 90, since she is currently 61 and has 8 years of surviving left to do. Theresa laughed. Good for her. Also, he said, there is something I need to tell you. She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead. I got a letter, he said, from a land company in San Francisco. They want to buy the Bar H. She was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I wrote back, he said, and told them the Bar H is not for sale, that it has never been for sale and will not be for sale in my lifetime or in the lifetime of my children. He glanced at her. I thought you should know I'd done that. Of course it's not for sale, she said. It's the Bar H. Yes, he said. They rode on through the desert evening, and the sky went rose and then deep blue, and the stars came out, and the valley waited for them ahead. James Robert was 13 in 1896 and interested in everything, which was his defining characteristic: medicine and ranching and engineering, and the natural world with equal intensity, cycling through enthusiasms that his parents found alternately charming and exhausting. He had begun to accompany Theresa to her practice on Saturday mornings, not because he had decided to become a physician, but because he had decided to understand everything, and medicine was part of everything. She was careful about what she let him see, and honest about what she explained, and she watched him absorb information with the hungry concentration that she recognized as her own trait coming out through the next generation. Harvey watched this with quiet satisfaction from the edges. Ruth Elizabeth was 9 in 1896 and was reading at a level that alarmed her teacher at the school and delighted her parents, and had developed an early and formidable ability to negotiate that Harvey maintained she had not gotten from either of them but had arrived with. Thomas was 7 and still cheerful and still curious, and had graduated from eating beetles to a more discerning palate, and spent most of his time either following James Robert or following Harvey around the ranch with the attentiveness of someone in accelerated learning. The Bar H in 1896 was a proper working ranch, 40 years settled in the valley's context, even if only Harvey's 23, with a small household staff and seasonal workers and a herd and a reputation for good beef throughout the region. Theresa rode out from the ranch to town 4 days a week still, though now Caroline managed the other 2 days competently, and the medical facility had a rhythm that felt established and solid. On a September evening in 1896, they sat on the porch of the Bar H, a porch that had been added to the original structure in 1885, and had become, over the years, the place where they brought the end of each day, and the valley was spread out below the ranch slope in the late summer evening, still green along the river, going brown at the margins. James Robert was inside, reading. Ruth Elizabeth was somewhere in the house, negotiating something. Thomas had been put to bed but was audibly not asleep. 14 years, Harvey said. She counted back. He meant since she had arrived in the valley. She had arrived in May of 1882, which made it 14 years in the spring. He was rounding up, which was not like him. 14 years next May, she said. He looked at her. He was 50 in 1896, and his hair was fully silver now, and the lines in his face were deeper, and he was the most familiar thing in the world to her, familiar the way the valley itself was familiar, the way the ridge looked in different lights, always the same and always with something new. The valley has needed you for years, he said. It was the thing Ruth had told her he had been saying before she came, and it was what he had said to the planning board when they questioned her appointment, and it was what he had told Jessup when Jessup had objected, and apparently it was still what he believed, which she found she needed to hear occasionally, because belief was nourishing when it was genuine. And now, she asked. Now it has you, he said. And I have you, and I intend to keep both facts for as long as I can possibly manage. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The evening was cooling in the way the desert always did, quickly and completely, and the stars were beginning to appear. Thomas's voice from inside the house. I am not asleep yet, Harvey called back without looking up. I know, be asleep in 10 minutes. A pause. 15. 10, Harvey said. Another pause. All right. She laughed against his shoulder quietly. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. The valley settled into its night sounds, the river in the distance, the last birds, the warm machinery of a working ranch going quiet. The porch of the Bar H in September of 1896, with 3 children inside and 14 years of a life built from a choice she had made on a train platform in Philadelphia with a worn leather bag, and a determination she had not fully understood at the time. This was what she had come here for, all of it. Not just the medicine, and not just the man, but the whole accumulated, complicated, essential thing. She had come to the frontier with a physician's bag and no plan to leave. She had stayed. The valley had needed her for years, and she had needed the valley, and it had given her everything she had not known to ask for: the work that made her whole, the man who made her real, the children who made the future personal, the place that was entirely and irrevocably hers. In the spring of 1897, her mother came from Philadelphia to visit. Margaret Lockhart was 71, and in the reasonable good health that her daughter assessed with clinical and filial satisfaction, and she arrived by train to Elko and was collected by Harvey in the ranch wagon and brought to Caldwell Valley, where she stood in the main street and looked at the medical facility with Theresa's name on the sign, the original one, repainted and in larger letters, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would have been so proud." Theresa held her mother's hand and thought about the physician's bag that had come from her father, the same bag she still used, the brass clasp worn smooth by 15 years of Theresa's hands. "I know," she said. Margaret Lockhart stayed for 6 weeks. She found Harvey quietly formidable and said so to Theresa in the particular way that mothers say things, not directly to the subject, but where he could hear. He seemed to find this both amusing and touching, which was approximately how he found most things. She played with Thomas, who was her particular project among the grandchildren, because he had the quality of requiring specific attention and responding to it with the particular warmth of children who know when they are genuinely seen. She read to Ruth Elizabeth, who had by now read most of the books in the house, and was deeply interested in her grandmother's account of Philadelphia and the world east of the desert. She talked with James Robert for hours about medicine, because James Robert had by 1897 made the decision that medicine was, in fact, his intention, and was working with that decision with the focus that both his parents recognized as characteristic. When Margaret left to go back east, standing at the Elko station with Harvey holding her bags, she took Theresa's face in her hands. "You're happy," she said. "You are genuinely, completely happy." "I am," Theresa said. "I worried," her mother said, "when you left." "I worried for years." "I know," Theresa said, "but you didn't need to." "I know that now," her mother said. "I can see that now." She kissed Theresa's cheek and let Harvey hand her up into the train car, and the train took her east, and Theresa and Harvey stood on the Elko platform until it was gone. On the ride back to Caldwell Valley, he reached over from his horse and took her hand briefly, the gesture of a man who has been doing this for 15 years and will, she knows with the kind of certainty that only time makes possible, be doing it 15 years from now. She held on. The valley was ahead of them, waiting as it always waited, full of everything they had built and everything they were still building. The school and the ranch and the medical facility, and the 3 children and the years of work and the years of love, and the particular grace of a life that had been made on purpose, out of hard material, in a place where the light was clear, and the air smelled like sage and something clean underneath it. She rode toward it with her physician's bag over the saddle horn and her husband's hand warm in hers, and no plan, even now, to leave. No plan at all.